Hey, folks, how's it going? We are live and it's April 10th, and we are going to be diving into what it takes to be a land detective. Or essentially, we're just talking about site assessment, site analysis, go into some somewhat more advanced stuff, maybe than what we've talked about before. Would love to get any of your questions, any of your input about what are some of your practices for analyzing sites, for observing all the different patterns on a site, and how you take that information and then use that to build out a design. So that's what we're going to be going into. Thanks so much for tuning in. And let me share a few things about kind of like what's happening here on the land right now. I want to share with you like the book of the month. So this month, I want to point out this book right here. I don't know if it's backwards for you guys, but it's Let the Water Do the Work by Bill Zedick. Induced Meandering, an Evolving Method for Restoring Incised Channels. This book is an incredible book when it comes to geomorphology, to watershed restoration, creek restoration. And I think what's especially awesome about that book, for those who just popped on, we're talking about Let the Water Do the Work by Bill Zedick. I think one of the things that's really amazing about that is just how strategic he is with his analysis of a watershed, of a drainage, of an incised channel, a stream bed, an erosion gully, and strategic to the sense of that. One of the things he teaches in this book is, finding those leverage points to do your work, right? So not just willy-nilly intervening in the system all over the place, but actually doing the analysis and finding those strategic locations to put that check dam, or let the water actually do the work of, say, filling a gully or restoring a watershed. And so that's really an awesome book. Check that one out. And then just a little tune in to, and by the way, please let me know that you can hear and see me okay. So if someone could jump on the chat and just let me know that the technology is working out, that'd be awesome. So the other thing that is kind of like a seasonal observation that we've been making as we get into springtime, a lot of different insects are starting to birth out, right? Birth out in the garden. There's a lot more pests out. There's a lot of beneficials out at the same time. And also there's, a lot of spiders coming out and a lot of little spider nests. And one of my favorites is when we find, I don't know if you all have ever come across this, a garden spider nest that is being born, right? So the garden spiders are like the big orb weavers, as big as a quarter. They eat tons and tons of insects in the garden, and we always let them, thrive and take over the garden, and then they lay their eggs and they grow their little nests. And so every time at this time of year, we're always seeing their nests explode with thousands and thousands of little spiders. Well, one thing is that, garden spiders are one thing, but there's all these other kind of spiders. And at our house, we had some kind of spider. I'm not sure what it was. It was like the week that it was being born in the house. And my daughter, Isla, she got a spider bite. That was pretty bad, not like, poisonous, go to the hospital bad, but it was like pretty bad, still healing about 3 weeks later. My wife, Lauren, she got a spider bite on her leg that is going through all kinds of crazy stuff. So the point of the story is, the more that we observe, all the different patterns and cycles that the life around us is going through, we can start to kind of bookmark those each year and kind of understand more about the depths of the ecology. The other one is that often the antidote is bursting forth at the same time that the venom is coming into play. So my wife, she still has this huge spider bite on her leg. And so we've been making a poultice of plantain, which is really going off right now. So this is an awesome medicinal plantain, and then mugwort. So we've been making a poultice of the plantain and the mugwort. grinding it up in a mortar and pestle, and she's been putting this poultice on it, and really kind of trippy. It's been sucking the venom out and the extra fluid that's in there. So when she's got the poultice on, her spider bite just starts draining out after a while. Anything else she puts on it, it won't do that. But once we put the poultice on, it starts draining it out. So that's a little herbal remedy for today. Mugwort and plantain. Making a poultice, you can chew it up, you could put it in a mortar and pestle, grind it up, add a little bit of water, make a poultice with it, put it on spider bites to pull that venom out. And of course, plantain is also great for bee stings, wasp bites, anything like that. Plantain is your go-to. Okay, so let's jump into what we're going to talk about today. Again, we are really talking about site assessment practices, and I do have a bit of a presentation here. So let me get to that. And we're going to start up here. So feel free to just throw questions in as we go. Also, let me know if things, if there's best practices that you're implementing. Let us know in the chat box. And thank you, Adam, for confirming that we're all good to go on the technology side. So first off, I like this concept of being a land detective. For me, it just, that frame always helps me get into the right mindset, really, around what I'm doing when I first walk onto a site. What am I doing? Am I when I get onto a site, am I just designing? I'm coming up with ideas. When I step onto a site and I consider myself a detective now, now I am gathering data, I'm gathering information to build out the base, my foundational understanding of a site. When I have that mind frame, it really helps me out. So one of the things that, of course, you're going to hear me say this, all year long, is that context is everything. All of our design solutions must be born out of an ongoing discussion with the land. And part of how we understand our context, how we discover our context, is this discussion. It's an evidence gathering, but it's also a discussion with the land, because things are always changing every single day, every week, every month, every year. Things are changing in the landscape. And so it's a two-way flow. If I make an intervention on the landscape, let's say I dig a ditch on contour, or I cut a tree down, or I plant a tree, or I pile up some brush, anything that I do on the land, there's going to be some kind of response, right? Wildlife is going to respond to it, or water is going to respond to it, or nutrients, soil is going to get built up around it. What are those responses? That's that discussion piece, right? It's not just about observation, but it's about observation, doing work, and receiving feedback. So it's always an ongoing discussion. But before we go anywhere else, the most important tool of the land detective, of the permaculturist, of the ecological designer is awareness. Awareness is the most important tool when you're reading a landscape, because what we often do is we often go onto a site as designers and we start designing. First off, you walk onto a site and you start seeing things. Oh, I see a low point there, or oh, I see water coming off of here, or this would be a good spot for the vegetable garden because of the way the sun is, soul orientation, right? So we walk onto a site, we start designing, and we think that our clients expect that of us too, that we're going to provide suggestions, and of course I do this. We can't get away. Us designer type people, really can't get away from designing when you're on a site. But as much as possible, especially if you're first entering a site, having a sense of awareness where you stop designing and you get into a listening place. I mean, honestly, listening to birds, listening to the sound of the wind, listening to what's going on for you, like what is your body doing when you're in different parts of the land. That tells you about microclimate. So there's a sense of deepening in and listening and reading to the patterns. And what we do if we're always designing is that we have too much going on in here to be able to really hear what's happening. And again, I'm not just saying hear like hear with your ears, that too, but also hear the deeper rhythm, the deeper pattern. What are the relationships that are taking place, the symbioses that are taking place that you can't really see or have a good understanding of until you've really quieted your mind, really, and taken the time to be there. So one thing that I like to do if I get into a design process with a client, and this would be, I'm talking beyond consultation now, go back into the student portal, to get updated on, our conversation about consultations and site assessment and all that. I mean, there's just hours and hours of content about all of this in the student portal. So some of this is a little repeat, but what I'm talking about here now isn't just at the consultation. It's not just the first time that you walk on the land, because that first time is kind of a sales conversation. There's a vetting. You're vetting the client's vetting you. You're trying to, figure out if this is a project you want to move forward with. If the client likes you, you kind of want to impress them. So there's all kinds of stuff going on during a consultation, which doesn't necessarily allow you to have that deep awareness. So what I like to do is when I get into the design process, I put time aside to walk out onto the land, and I ask that the clients aren't there. I go by myself and I take time to just kind of almost have like a walking meditation on the land. Of course, design ideas are going to come up, and probably as soon as you quiet your mind, all your best ideas are going to flow through. That's just normally how it seems to happen. But what can happen is after about 30 to 45 minutes of walking quietly on the land in a space of awareness is that you start to see a lot of different things going on. You start to notice where the squirrels have been packing their acorns, and you start to ask questions about, well, why did they choose this tree rather than that tree? What kind of acorns are they packing? And what does that mean? What kind of implication does that mean for what's happening in this oak woodland or what's happening at this time of year? So as you start to identify some of those deeper relationships between species, between animals and plants, between humans and the land, as you start to get into those deeper relationships, because you have that place of awareness, you can start asking the right questions. And as you start to ask the right questions, then the way that informs your design process is huge, because now you're actually truly designing from a place of composing with the land rather than imposing. And I know that's kind of a cliche statement. I've probably said it many times, and you might have heard others say it too. But it still rings true. And if we truly want to compose with nature and compose with the land, then we have to take this time to be in a place of awareness, to really tune in to those deeper patterns. The other nice thing about it is, it's good for your body to quiet your mind and just be in a peaceful state with the land. But honestly, I would say the most illuminating data about a landscape comes for me when I'm in that state, when I'm not talking to anyone, I'm not trying to impress anyone, I'm not really trying to design, I'm just in that listening state. And that's where you really get a lot of aha moments. So awareness and giving yourself time to really drop into a space. There's so much going on in nature between insects and the soil, and birds and insects, and plants and soil, and plants and insects, and wildlife and insects, and mammals and insects, and mammals and soil. There's like so many complex patterns and relationships. And the other thing is that even if you observe the same site day after day, year after year, for the rest of your life, you're going to discover new things there. Even if it's a small plot, you're still going to discover new things, because the climate's changing. One year you have a drought, another year you have a flood year, whatever the extremes are in your area. Those changes, and they might be changes even 100 miles away, which affect wildlife patterns, insect patterns, blooming patterns. So things are always going to be changing. So this part of the process, it never, ever stops. All right, let's get back to this. So The other part of this is you're not only looking for consistent patterns. For instance, oh, I realize that, this area is dominated by cork oaks, or I see that the deer are really a lot of deer in this area. Those might be consistent patterns that you'll see in and out on a site. But the other thing, and this is a bit more of an advanced concept, is the lack of patterns. Don't just look for patterns, look for the break in patterns. And it's those breaks in patterns which really illuminate important weaknesses in the system or potentially strengths in the system. So if you were tracking animals, for instance, you would look for a break in the pattern. If you're looking out at a meadow or an orchard that's filled with grass, and then you notice an area where the grass is pushed down, that's a break in the pattern, and that tells you about, that some animal might have been moving through there. As you start to look for those breaks in patterns, you'll be able to uh, really ask the right questions about why particular things are happening on the site. All right, let's get into some specific things here. So soil and its indicators. We're not going to get into soil tests. I mean, there's a bunch of that stuff in the student portal about soil tests. And if you guys have some soil tests that work really well for you, go ahead and leave a chat about that. But the thing about soil is that it is so diverse. Soil is just so diverse. And in fact, where I live in coastal California, we have some of the most diverse soils anywhere in the world. Like there's hundreds of different kinds of soils. And even the Permaculture Skill Center, which is our 5-acre demonstration farm learning center in Sebastopol, California, there's even 3 different kinds of soils on that 5 acres. So it's not really enough just to kind of identify sort of a bigger picture, like, oh, I've got this soil type here. You really do want to take the time to identify if there's different types of soils on a site, because they're going to have different implications around drainage, right? Like how it relates to water, the kind of plants that can grow there, what kind of minerals deficiencies might be present. And it just on and on, it leads to a whole lot of data and questions that will help you understand what's actually going on the site. And I'm going to go to I've got a little Google Earth thing here. So we're going to be spending some time in this platform today. And I wanted to show you, so these little reddish pins here are representing soil. So this is the area where I live. I hope you all can see this okay. This is the area where I live. I actually live right here, 9271 Country Lane. And this area here is the wetland. All this green area is called the Laguna de Santa Rosa. Actually, let's hit the 3D here. So give you a sense. Okay. And so you can see that where we have this sandy loam here, it's the very first little bump in topography on the west side of this huge wetland right here, right? So down in the wetland, notice the correlation between heavy clay, which is all in this wetland area, and then the flood zone. So heavy clay and flooding, if you're down in a bottomland, can go hand in hand. And then the very first little ridge, I mean, these are really small ridges, are a sandy loam. So it's pretty interesting that we've got heavy clay. And then as soon as we get into this first little ridge, we have all this sandy loam. This is the whole city of Sebastopol right here. And then as we get a little farther out west, we get into Gold Ridge loam, which is a totally different kind of loam. And this whole, you can even see, I mean, this is brown grass because it's taken in the summer, but the soil is this color. So all of this ridge, all these ridges here are all Gold Ridge loam. And if we zoom in here to, it's a yellow pin, but this is my property here, and we have Gold Ridge loam as well. So one of the things you want to do, and I'm gonna just kind of pan out here so we can see what's going on. One of the things you want to do is not only understand all the different soils on a single site, but also get to know your region. right? Like if you get to know the parent soils in different parts of where you live, different areas, then when you get a job, like if I get a job in here, down in the Laguna de Santa Rosa, I don't even need to do a soil test to know that I'm going to be in heavy clay with very little drainage. I already know that just because of the basic region. If I get a job in Sebastopol, pretty much all of Sebastopol is a sandy loam. And if I get a job out west of Sebastopol, I know that it's mostly Goldridge loam until we get a little farther west. So having this general idea of the way soils respond, interact in your area, and the different kind of parent soils really helps to just automatically have a snapshot of if you get called out to a different zone, what might be happening there, even the plants, all the things that soil indicates to you about water, about plants, about health and vitality of the system. So I know I'm kind of oscillating between two things. I'm looking at a more macro view of soils, and then we've got the more the more acute view when you go in. And here let's zoom into the Permaculture Skill Center. These are a little bit old pictures, so they're not really showing everything. So here we are at the Permaculture Skill Center. We're right along this highway here. And so we've got at least 3 different soil types right here on this land. And I know that right around here is a break in where we go from one soil type in these farm beds here. And then this farm here is actually in a totally different soil type. And it's pretty interesting right here. This was actually a chicken tractor. This is the some of the best drained area on the whole 5 acres is this one spot right here where the water table isn't as high and it has better drainage, this spot and this food forest area. So because of the different soil types that we have a very different pattern, very different relationship to water in these different sites. Okay, so let's come back here now. If there's any questions about soil or input, throw that in the chat there. So obviously soil and its indicators. Oh, I will just say this, that actually getting a soil test, doing the testing and sending it to a lab, that's just best practice. And I know you all are in different regions, so you find a soil testing lab close to you if you can. It's not that expensive to send it away to a lab. I don't have one queued up right here. We use a local company to send our soil tests away. But a few things to know about sending away for a soil test. First off is that there's your basic soil test where you're going to get, mineral breakdown, organic matter content, your pH, things like that, NPK, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. So there's your basic soil test, and that's really important. And often in those soil tests, they're going to tell you that, oh, you have a calcium deficiency. Here's a suggestion of you should get oyster shell powder, and here's the application rate we suggest. Things like that. So that's your basic soil test. Now, one of the situations we have here, and depending on the kind of projects you all are working on, this might come up too. Like if you're in urban environments, if there's any concern about pollution, then there's very specific soil tests you can do for that. And one of the big issues around here is the fires that happened. So, we had these huge fires in October, and over 5,000 structures got burned to the ground, and all that ash went up and it came back down. And so lots and lots of people around here, organic farmers and home gardeners and folks are rightly concerned about what might be in the soil now because of the ash fall. Luckily, some of the folks around where I live have done soil tests and haven't found any issues. So that's really great. I haven't heard yet about folks closer to the fire zone. I'm about 8 miles away. So potentially there's toxins, heavy metals and such that might have accumulated in some people's soil. And you really want to know that. And if you're in the middle of a city and you're planning a project, you want to know what's in that soil too, because a lot of buildings before 1970 were painted with lead. And that lead, that paint flakes off, gets into the soil, and contaminates the soil with lead, which is an issue that we have a lot in the Bay Area, San Francisco and Oakland. A lot of the soils there are contaminated with lead, but there's only one way to know for sure, and that's to get a soil test. So use that as a tool for understanding what's happening. And of course, if you discover that you have lead toxicity in your soil, then that's going to totally change your design. That's why being the land detective, gathering the evidence, gathering the information is really so vital, is because it's going to tell you some really important information. You don't want to grow an organic garden and feed people carrots that are growing in lead-laden soil, because that could, there could be a toxicity issue there. So, okay, so that's, we're going to move on from soil now. Just some things to think about there with soil. Topography implications. So I think often as permaculturists, as ecological landscapers, we do kind of get the large scale implications of topography, because we're always looking at topo maps and we're thinking swaling and contours and water harvest. And so, topography is something that I know you all have a basic understanding of, but it's the small scale stuff that is the things that we often miss. And this is something I've learned from general engineering contractors, is just being able to look at small patterns on the landscape. A little bump where, maybe there was the foundation for some old shed or something like that, and it's gotten grown over. And that little bump is enough to shunt acres of water that are flowing down and, hit this little bump and get shunted around, and it changes the entire hydrology of the whole site. These are the things that we tend to miss when we're doing our site assessment, are those little tiny drainage issues that often come about because of human intervention, roads, culverts, structures, grading things that we've done. So don't only pay attention to the bigger topographical patterns. Obviously, that is absolutely key information and data. And we've talked about this a ton in the Elm School already in the student portal. But what I really want to highlight now is being really aware of those little tiny changes. Even sometimes I'll even find a little drain, like a little grate, a drain inlet, we call it, that might be a little overgrown in grass. And just a drain inlet placed in a particular location on the land can drastically change all the hydrology on that landscape. And it's just like a little thing that could totally be missed. And if you don't take the time to, really do that deep observation, obviously observing it during the wet time of year when everything's raining and wet, is going to yield better information than observing it when it's not raining and wet. But take time to look for those little changes. The other side of it is one of the issues I think that permaculturists and contractors often make is that we want to do these big changes. We want to make these big interventions on the land, huge terraces and huge swales. And hey, I have fun doing those as well in the appropriate context. I love projects like that. But sometimes it's actually more appropriate just to do a small grading change, just to change the slope of a road, or maybe the direction of a road will make all the changes required to move the water in a way that's more desirable for an ecological landscape. Or sometimes it's just, like I said, grading out a little bump, or identifying that the water was pulled out of its natural drainage through a drain inlet and put into somewhere where it really shouldn't have gone. And now it's creating erosion, and you just want to put it back into its normal drainage. So sometimes the simple solutions are the most effective. They're the most cost effective for sure. Sometimes they're the only solution that you need, are those simple little topographical changes, those little more micro grading issues. And again, back to this book, Let the Water Do the Work. Part of what the frame of that is to respect the intelligence of water. And but the more that we can respect the intelligence of water and the way that it wants to move naturally on a site, the more that we can reduce the larger interventions potentially and make smaller changes. Applying that principle in permaculture, make the least change for the greatest effect. So if we're constantly applying that principle in permaculture, then potentially we're saving our clients tons of money. We're making the project easier. We're having a higher success rate. So just some things to think about there. A lot of this is stuff that I think I noticed that even more advanced folks seem to miss. So that's what I'm just sort of trying to catch, some of this more advanced stuff. So let's talk about wildlife activity and why it's so important to understand. Oh, a little typo there. Why it's so important to understand. I'll just fix that. In relation to reading a site, in relation to gathering evidence on a site. So some things to be looking for are wildlife pathways, nesting sites, roosting patterns, bird language. And then what do birds tell you about the seasons? Because many birds are migratory and they play different roles and different functions on the site, but they only visit a site at certain times of the year. So the more that you can track this year after year, what kinds of species are coming at what time of the year, what kinds of ecological roles are they playing on the site, in the landscape, will give you a greater understanding of how to support these species, or actually support the functions that they provide in the landscape. This morning, it was really cool. There's house finches nesting right outside my house here. So they've just come. They're just starting to build their nests now. And I noticed that they had a thing going on with a wren today. And again, wrens, they're only coming at a certain time of year as well. So it's really cool in the springtime to observe, who's coming and visiting, where are they building their nests, what do they eat? What kind of seeds do they eat? What kind of insects do they eat? Because you might be able to encourage their foraging in the landscape. And what time of the year do they come through? And so the more that we can kind of understand some of those patterns, like I may have told this story in Elm School already, but it is worth repeating. My neighbor right up the road, they have the original homestead. So I live on what is a 100-year-old Gravenstein apple orchard. What's left of it was an 80-acre Gravenstein apple orchard, and we've got about 10 of the trees left on our property. So the original homestead, there's a 1916 barn and water tower, a few properties upslope from me. And so in that water tower, there's barn owls that roost in the top of the water tower. And they've been doing that year after year. And so my neighbor put a infrared camera there. So he's been recording them. So a couple of years ago, he recorded in May that the daddy owl went and caught 91 gophers in an 18-day period, because my neighbor was able to see it with the video, and he was tracking every single one that daddy barn owl was out hunting, because they had 4 owlets and mama who was hanging out in the nest. So how amazing that we have this incredible ally in the barn owl that's out hunting gophers, especially during a time of year where gopher populations are exploding and wreaking havoc on the gardens and landscapes around here. So what do we do with that knowledge? Well, one is, we can just understand when these cycles are playing out, and two, we can actually accentuate, barn owl habitat by building more barn owl homes. Where are those owlets going to go, right? Like, let's create spaces for those young owls to come roost on our property or another neighbor's property, so we increase the management of the gopher population in our area. So that's just, again, a little bit about how birds and wildlife can really tell us a little bit about what's going on at the time of year. And a whole deeper body of work and knowledge that we don't have time to get in today, but is vitally important to ecological landscapers, to permaculturists, is nature awareness. And there's so much great workshops and classes and books on nature awareness from John Young and and Weaving Earth. And there's like a whole bunch of great folks in Nature Awareness School. And we're going to get some of those folks in here to Elm to speak on a much deeper level around how tracking and bird language are incredible tools for the landscape reader. So let's just go back here for a moment. Folks, if you have questions, drop them in there. I'm going to get into microclimates in a second. Give me just one moment. I'll have to step out. I will be right back in 1 minute. Cool. Sorry about that. All right. You know what we're going to do? We are going to go back to this Google image here and zoom out. So how do you get to know microclimates in your area? One great way is, just understanding first off that cold air sinks. So when we look at this whole area here, we have a few different microclimates. So first off, sorry about this. So this entire Laguna wetland, not only is it heavy clay, not only is it the flood zone, but this is also the frost and fog zone because it's at the low point. So this whole zone, including much of Santa Rosa, this is Santa Rosa over here. This entire low area is like a big cold air catch. So again, when we understand how air moves, how cold air sinks and warm air rises, we can kind of look at the macro area, our region, from a more macro point of view, and be able to create like some bookmarks around some general microclimate information. So let's just start with some of the general microclimate information. So first off, we've got this big wetland here, which we know is going to be one of our more frosted areas. So we're not in this area, we're not necessarily planting a lot of frost sensitive plants, subtropicals, citrus and things like that. We're in a temperate zone. Some of you might not be able to grow any citrus at all where you are, but we can grow citrus in some spots, but down here, generally we can't. But if you move over here to the city, even though a big chunk of it is in the wetland, we have the cityscape radiant heat. So because there's so many buildings, so much concrete and asphalt, it creates a scenario where, basically cities are absorbing heat all day long and then radiating that heat back out. And then there's all of these little pockets because of all the buildings and structures and everything like that. There's just all of these little microclimate pockets where certain zones are being protected. Sometimes you'll come into a cityscape and the north side of a building won't get any sun ever, because here where we're in the northern hemisphere where I am, so it'd be the opposite in the southern hemisphere. But sometimes the north side of a building may not get any sun whatsoever. And I've even had projects where that was actually the whole project was just a little patch of ground on the north side, and maybe there was a building on the west side there, and there was just no sun. And so you get a lot of really weird climates, in the city areas. So, taking time to develop. One thing that I like to do is I like to develop plant lists that can work in different microclimates. So that way, if I have a client in the city and I show up and it's one of these north side building scenarios where it's like always cold and dark, but then, maybe 2 days in the summer, it gets blasted with sun. That's the really funny thing that can happen, is sometimes then they'll have these windows where it just blasts with sun. Well, there's only a few plants that can really work in those kind of scenarios. So the more that you get to know all the different microclimates in your region, well, you can start developing plant lists that actually work within those different microclimates. Now over here, let me zoom in here. I'm going to go back to 2D for a second. So over here, we have a really interesting situation. Let's come on down to my space. So right here, this is my where I live right here, where it says banana belt. I live right in a banana belt. I'm on a ridge that's about 400 feet above sea level. And a lot of my neighbors all around here have just thriving citrus, oranges and lemons and all this kind of stuff. And that all does really well. We have very little frost, but just about 200 feet away, we've got this spot right here. This farm, this is Singing Frogs Farm. Some of you may have heard of it. They're internationally renowned no-till farm, and they're good friends and our neighbors. And so they're literally 3 properties away. Let's see, where are we? Here we are. So there's a property here, and then Singing Frog Farm. So they're 3 properties away, but because they are in the creek floodplain, you can see, well, the vineyards have done their thing. Here's the Atascadero Creek. This vineyard is all in the floodplain. So this whole zone here gets so cold. They get temperatures in the teens, Fahrenheit, so maybe I think it might have gotten down to like 18 degrees Fahrenheit this year. We don't ever get below, we might get a little bit of frost on a certain part of the property here, but we'll never get that cold. It's on average 10 degrees warmer, just a few hundred feet at our place as it is there. So we can grow a whole different set of plant species than they can. So I just think it's just so interesting how different microclimates can be. But then to go even further, we've got this spot. Oh, where is it? Over here, this upper ridge warm area. So these were clients of mine as well. And what they have is macadamia nuts up here, and a whole bunch of subtropicals up here that are totally thriving, big mature citrus orchard. I can't grow half of what they grow here. I can't grow at my place, which is just, a couple miles away, right here. So get to know how all these different microclimates work, and don't expect that anywhere where you are is going to be the same or similar to, even next door neighbors are going to have different microclimates. I think I told some stories in the student portal about, planting trees in the drip line of other trees, that if you are in a frosty area, that's a little trick you can do, is you can literally plant, like here on my property. This is an old picture, so it doesn't actually show the garden. That's too bad. This is right when we were developing this place. We removed a bunch of eucalyptus, as you can see here, and we're remodeling the house. You can see that. But like right in the drip line of, say, these trees on the south facing side is even another microclimate that is less frost sensitive than out here in the open, because these trees produce a little bit of insulation. So, really take the time when you're out on a landscape to understand how air moves, and understand topography. And one thing that's so cool, especially where we are, is that on the north side of slopes, let me go 3D again. And how can I turn this thing around? Oops, sorry. So right down here, there's a little pin right over here that says North Slope Spring. This is the neighborhood spring, and it actually feeds these two ponds here. You can see these two ponds. So, here's the floodplain, and then this is a little ridge that goes up, and then this is basically on the northeast slope. This is where we find water in the northern hemisphere. We find so much more water on the north side, the north orientation of our hills. So just knowing that, if you go out onto a site, if it's a broadacre project or whatever the orientation is, sorry about that, whatever the orientation is, just knowing that springs generally are going to show up on the north side. This is totally a microclimate thing, because trees can grow bigger and lusher on the north side. They're not getting the intensity of those summer sun that you get on the south side. So I know this is like some basic stuff, but it really makes a huge difference, especially if you're working on bigger, broader projects and you're trying to understand water resources and you're sleuthing out where the water is. Well, it's almost always going to be on the north side of a slope. I mean, it's not, obviously everything is site specific, and there's plenty of situations where water might be on the south side, but generally you're going to find your springs and seeps on the north side. So that's just another way that climate plays a role in water, and how it relates to water, and then how we can use this information in our design. So how's it going, folks? Are there, I'll come back here. How is it going? Are there questions? Is this too simple for you? Do you what do you need? Let me know if you guys want to steer the conversation anywhere else. I'll just keep going unless you guys have questions or want to steer the conversation anywhere. So let's see. Yes. All right. The social assessment layers. Oh yeah. Another aspect of our detective work that really goes, doesn't take, as important a role in the process for many landscapers, especially permaculturists are a little bit better at this, is really assessing your clients, the site managers, neighbors, the community, and the cultural and financial layers of the project. So when we take the time to really assess all the social layers, because we're designing landscapes that humans are relating to, because people are spending money on these landscapes, they have dreams and visions for the space, or they've been living there for generations. There's a lot of information that we can get from from the neighbors and people who've been on a site. Two, by fully understanding a client's needs, goals, dreams, behaviors, activities, you can design, to those needs. You can support them in a way that you wouldn't be able to do if you ignored them. So understanding the social layers of a project are, in some ways just as important as understanding all the ecological layers, the soil, the water, the climate, the habitat, and all of that. So I find that it's the people that is often the make or break. And sometimes it's really interesting. I don't know if you all have ever been in this situation where the clients will give you one bit of information about a site, um, about the patterns on the landscape, what they observed. Sometimes we'll say clients, "Hey, well, what was it like last year? I wasn't here. What did the water do last year? Or what kinds of wildlife have you observed?" And sometimes you get different information depending on who you talk to. So you don't always want to just listen to the clients. If you get a chance to talk to the neighbors, or you get a chance to deepen it and find folks who've been living in the area for a long time. I've got neighbors that have been around for multiple generations, over 100 years. And it's really cool to hear what they have to say about what it used to be like. We learned that near the Permaculture Skill Center, there used to be a native toad that was all over that area. We haven't seen one ever. They seem to be completely gone. But what were the conditions? When I learn about that kind of natural history, that a native toad used to be in high population on a site, I start to ask myself the right questions. Well, what were the conditions that favored the toad, and what is the break in the pattern now? Now, again, this is like not just looking at the pattern, but the break in the pattern. Where is the break in the pattern that is not providing for these toads? And I think in our area, it might be the lack of vernal pools, because the Laguna de Santa Rosa and where the Permaculture Skill Center is part of this vernal pool system. And a lot of those vernal pools have been removed because farmers have graded them out so that they can have better grazing land and farming land. So sometimes the break in the pattern leads us to ask the right questions, which then leads us to design approaches which make more sense within the ecological patterns and elements that are taking place on the site. Hope that makes sense. It also, by asking people who have multiple generations of knowledge, it helps us understand what happened, what went before, what kind of uses were happening before on the land, and how might those past historical uses of the land changed what may have been a thriving system at some point. So pay special attention to all those social layers and do that research. One time I was looking at, I wanted to redesign my whole town of Sebastopol, and I was doing a bunch of research in there, and I discovered, and you can do this, you could go down to your county or your city, depending on if you live in a county or a city, and often they'll have information. They've already done environmental assessments of a lot of areas. They've done, you could get soils reports, you can get climate reports, you can get wildlife reports and water patterns. I mean, a lot of data is actually already there and prepackaged for you at planning department offices. So I went down to Sebastopol because I was looking at wanting to influence how the city designs its public spaces. And I went down, and it just so happened that there was like a 200-page packet of an environmental assessment of Sebastopol going back decades, giving all kinds of historical context, land use context, wildlife context, water pattern context, climate context. I mean, it was deep, and it took me months to actually go through all of that information. Now, when I walk through the town, because I've had a chance to really absorb that research, now when I walk through the city, I see it in a totally different light. And I understand why the egrets are roosting on that one ridge better, because there used to be, a reservoir over in this area. It illuminates so much, and we can use that data and that information to be good designers. So in the end, we never want to stop observing and assessing. Every time you walk on the site, you want to drop into that awareness and always be monitoring so that you can constantly tweak the system, ongoing management, because the land is always changing. And the most important, if you don't get anything else out of this, is to remember that the observation and assessment process, the becoming the detective on the land, is a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation that never ends. And if you get really good at walking onto a site and then dropping into that awareness and then observing all the relationships that are going on between life on the land and humans in the land and structures in the land, as all the connecting points between elements on the site. If you get really good at walking onto a site, even if you've been there 1,000 times, and dropping into that scope, that view, you're always going to see something new. And it's not always the best. Say if I walk onto a job site that my team is working on, and I notice all these things that we should do different or things that are missing. The more often that you can tune in to ways to tweak a system so that it can be more ecological, more regenerative, more successful, you'll be getting that information every single time you walk onto a site. So stay in that place of awareness. Remember that the design is never done, and that life is always changing and growing. So that's what I have for you today. If you have any questions, then fire away here. Otherwise, we're going to close up this session. Remember, of course, as you're out working on your projects, as you're out doing consultations, doing site assessments, bring your questions to the Facebook group. I would love to hear what kind of tools you're using in your site assessment processes, or places where you're getting stuck, or places where you need more information. Let us know in the Facebook group. Ask your questions, and we'll provide as much support for you as we can. So with that, I'm going to say good night. All the best to you on your projects, and I hope to see you soon. Oh, and next week we have Rick Taylor from Elder Creek Landscapes. He's been doing ecological design and permaculture for the last 20 years. He works on all different scale projects. He'll be with us next week to talk about project management best practices and all the other gold stuff that he has to offer. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again. Bye.